front top upper, front top lower, back top, back facing sleeve, skirt front, skirt back, skirt side. Sew up the darts on the back top. On the main fabric, mark out the notches on the front top upper and lower panels. Sew the panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Prepare the ribbon piece, each 6 cm long. Put the ribbon in between the notches. And baste them down with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Let's sew the ribbon to the other side. Put the ribbon in between the notches and baste down with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Sew the front and back top panels together at the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. On the lining fabric, mark out the notches on the front top upper and lower panels. Sew the panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew the front panels to the back facing along the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. Push aside one side to expose the neckline. Align the lining fabric to the neckline and sew the panels with a 1 cm seam allowance, starting 4 cm away from the center back. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce the tension. Flip open the lining panel. With the seam allowances pushed towards the lining, understitch on the lining fabric, making sure to catch onto the seam allowances below. Repeat for the other side. Push aside the completed panel to expose the neckline. Align the lining fabric and sew the panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance, starting 4 cm away from the center back. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce tension. Flip open the lining fabric. Push all the seam allowances towards the lining and iron well. Understitch on the lining fabric, making sure to catch onto the seam allowances below. To secure the lining and main fabrics together, baste both panels along the armhole, side seam and waist with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Sew the front and back panels together along the side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. On the sleeve panel, mark out the notches. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitches along the sleeve crown. Fold the sleeve into half and sew along the side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Fold up the sleeve hem by 3 cm and iron well. Then top stitch 2 cm from the folded edge. Sew the sleeve to the armhole with a 1 cm seam allowance, focusing all the gathers towards the shoulder seam. Back skirt and side skirts. Mark out the notches. Sew the side skirt to the back skirt with a 1 cm seam allowance, making sure to match up the notches. Front skirt, side skirts. Mark out the notches. Sew them together with a 1 cm seam allowance, making sure to match up the notches. Sew the front and back skirt panels together along the side seams with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew the top to the skirt with a 1 cm seam allowance. Flip down the seam allowances and iron well. From the right side, top stitch on the skirt panel, making sure to catch onto the seam allowance below. Push away the facing on the main fabric. Start sewing the zipper 1 cm down from the neckline along the center back with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. At the bottom of the zip, finish sewing up the center back with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Flip down the facing so that it covers the zip. Make sure that the zip is opened up. Sew 1 cm horizontally across and vertically down. Make sure that you're sewing on the outside of the zip. Repeat for the other side. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce bulk. Turn it inside out. At the skirt hem, fold it up by 1.5 cm seam allowance and iron well. Then top stitch 1 centimeter from the folded edge. To tie a bow, prepare a ribbon 40 centimeter in length. Tie once, ensuring both sides are of equal lengths. Fold the bottom ribbon, then taking the top ribbon, tuck it in and fold under. Shape and neaten until desired. And there you have it, your dress is completed.